I'm going to kick things off with our first panel and introduce you to what is really an all-star lineup of people I'm really excited to be talking to today. Jennifer Kavanagh will start things off. She wrote a book about truth decay. She's a senior fellow in American Statecraft at the Carnegie Endowment. Her book, Truth, Decay, an Initial Exploration of the Diminishing Role of Facts and Analysis in American Public Life, came out in 2018. And she'll talk about that book and the research she's done since then. To my left, Jonathan Rauch approaches this epistemic crisis from a more philosophical angle. What is knowledge and how is it created? His 2021 book, The Constitution of Knowledge, is subtitled A Defense of Truth, which is exactly what we need today. Trained as a journalist, Jonathan has earned a reputation as one of America's most gifted and thoughtful writers, and today he's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And we'll have on the screens above you, Gordon Crovitz, who's seen the problem of truth decay up close. He is a former publisher, editorial board member, and opinion columnist for the Wall Street Journal. In 2018, he left journalism to co-found a company called NewsGuard. Their flagship product is a browser extension that shows you how reliable news sources really are in real time. So with that, Jennifer, I'll turn things over to you to get us started. What is truth decay exactly?
So we defined, I worked on this book when I was still at Rand Corporation in 2018, who just retired as the CEO of Rand. And we defined truth decay as the diminishing role that facts and analysis increasingly play in our political and civil discourse and in the policymaking process. And we suggested that it's characterized by 4 trends that are interrelated. The first is increasing disagreement about facts and data. Disagreement about the safety of vaccines is a great example. We've seen that in spades over the past couple of years. There's a ton of evidence that shows they're safe, and yet an increasing number of people believe that they're not. Second, a blurring of the line between fact and opinion. You see this pretty much anytime you read the newspaper, when you go online. And alongside this, an increasing relative volume of opinion compared to fact. There's a ton of commentary out there. There's more and more news outlets, and it's not all filled with fact-based information. That means that even people who want to find fact-based information have to dig through a lot of material before they can find it. And that's difficult, and people often give up. And finally, declining trust in key sources of information. Places like the government, the media, trust in these institutions is incredibly low. People no longer look to them as sources of factual information. Even experts, which is the theme of our panel today, are increasingly distrusted by a large portion of the population. So a few things to note about this definition is that even though we call it truth decay, we're really talking about facts. But facts decay doesn't sound very good. So, we're going to call it truth decay. But we're really interested here is the role of facts and the extent to which they are considered or discarded in political discourse and policymaking. We could have endless debates about truth. What is truth? Maybe Jonathan's going to get into that, but we put that aside and we focused on facts. Second, the term decay implies that things are getting worse. And I think that that's accurate, but we also distinguish that from saying that we're in like a post-truth era, because there are areas where facts and data actually matter more and more. Think about the explosion in sports analytics and data in baseball and basketball. So data does matter, and it matters more in certain sectors, but not in these kind of hot button political issues. That's where we really see the role of facts data declining. And finally, information is a key piece of truth decay, obviously, but it's not only about information. It's not only about disinformation. It really is a systemic phenomenon with institutional drivers. And that's really important when we think about the causes and when we think about the solutions. So shifting over to talk a little bit about the causes, I think this is where we've learned the most. So we published this book in 2018 at the very beginning. That means most of the work was done in 2017 and 2016. And so we've had 5 years since then. We've learned a lot about this phenomenon and what's driving it. So I'm going to talk about drivers in sort of 3 buckets. The first would be the environment. And here I think you have to talk about polarization. And I don't just mean political polarization, but also social and demographic polarization. The extent to which our society is balkanized into small enclaves of people who are all pretty much the same, which creates narratives and alternative narratives. It's this polarization that's a key driver and a key demand signal for a lot of the disinformation that we see. The second set of drivers I'm going to call supply. And here is changes in the information environment, but not the information specifically. That's not what I'm talking about. It's changes in the way information is produced and the way it's consumed. Social media is a part of the problem, but it's not the only part of the problem. There's also been major changes in the industry of journalism, in the ability of traditional news outlets to turn a profit, and the ways in which that profit motive has affected what they produce and how they produce it. And Gordon can talk about this, in a lot of detail from his experience. But that does affect the types of things that are produced. And that means that even outlets that we would consider credible, like the New York Times and the Washington Post, often produce things that have a ton of opinion, that often have headlines that don't actually reflect what's in the article, or that are horribly misleading. And that's a part of the problem too. We may not be as worried about that as blatant disinformation about the election on social media, but that is a part of the problem. So understanding that systemic nature. And then third, on the demand side, there's a couple of factors. The first is cognitive bias, which is just the way we process information can often lead us astray. We tend to look for things that prove that we're right. We're heavily influenced by the thing we saw most recently or the thing that we see most often, and that may not be the thing that's actually accurate. Second, media literacy and our skills. Do people have the ability to navigate a really complex and changing online environment to find fact-based information? The answer is probably not for most people. Obviously, media literacy, there's been a big push for it. People are getting better. There's a lot of training in schools, and yet there's still a huge gap, not only for children in schools, but also for adults. Think about all of us who grew up without smartphones and were out of school by the time we got our first smartphone. Where are we supposed to learn how to navigate, how to make decisions about what's fact-based and what's not? And then finally, interest level and trust and engagement. Surveys that look at how much people trust news and how engaged people are really astounding. People not only do not trust news outlets, but they're not engaged. They just don't care. We've done some work that shows that about 30% of people recognize the sources that they're using are not credible ones, and they keep using them anyway, which suggests that they're getting something else out of news other than news, whether it's entertainment or some other kind of value. The recent Gallup surveys that look at confidence in institutions show that trust in big tech is significantly higher than trust in print and television news. So we think of big tech as being sort of the bad guy, but people trust big tech more than they trust print and television news. And I think we have to recognize that when we think about solutions on demand and supply side solutions, that this is the environment that we're dealing with. So where does this leave us? In the 5 years or 4 years since the book came out, I think things have gotten significantly worse for all the time that we spent talking about this and studying it. I think the problem has gotten worse. And it's driven by systemic and structural factors, characteristics of our political environment, our information environment, our social institutions, our relationships with each other. And so there are a lot of solutions proposed that deal with the symptoms, and disinformation I would put as a symptom of this larger problem, whether that's fact checking or media literacy. These things deal with the symptoms. They're not actually getting at the systemic drivers of the problem. So what are the systemic, what are the types of solutions that I'm thinking of when I'm talking about getting at systemic drivers? I mean, this is where changes to the basic business model of journalism, changes, not necessarily moderation, but changes to the way we think about platform accountability, changes to our political institutions that address some of the polarization and drivers on that end. Obviously, that's a huge morass that we're probably not going to solve today, but that has to be addressed or it's going to keep feeding this problem. So as experts, what's our role? I think our role is to focus on these systemic changes, to identify the institutional changes that we can make. And obviously it's going to be incremental at first, but I think that's where we should be focusing our energy rather than on addressing the symptoms, because I don't think addressing the symptoms actually solves the problem in the long term. A good analogy would be if I tell you I have a headache and you give me an Advil and it goes away for a little while, but I actually have a brain tumor, I need help with the brain tumor, not an Advil to cover up the pain. And that's sort of the situation I think we're in. We've gotten a lot of painkillers to help us reduce some of the symptoms, but we haven't really addressed the underlying problem. So I'm going to stop there. Turn it over.
Thank you, Jennifer. So you've described dysfunction. Jonathan, what does a healthy constitution of knowledge look like? Why do you talk about that instead of a marketplace of ideas?
First, thank you, Berin, for having me. I see some friends in the room, which is great. And special thanks to Jennifer, whose report, Truth, Decay, really is invaluable to all of us, was very helpful in writing my book. I urge everyone to read it. And I wind up in a similar place from Jennifer, but I'll take briefly a different route to get there. The title of my next 5 to 7 minutes of monologue will be The Constitution of Knowledge, or Why I Am Not a Techno-Libertarian. Constitution of knowledge, what is this concept? It turns out that individuals are very, very bad at discerning truth. And if you want to know why read Truth, Decay, it lists many, though by no means all, of the cognitive and social biases that we suffer from. And societies need some kind of account of truth for public purposes. Traditionally, the way that's been done is through authoritarianism, for example, priests, politburos, or through civil war for just violence and fighting, coercion. The Constitution of Knowledge emerges as a solution to those problems around, 300 years ago, around the same time as liberal democracy and liberal markets, its close cousins. And it says, we will repose authority over reality in no one in particular. We will substitute rules for rulers. What's created, scientific revolution, legal revolution, later in government and in journalism in the 19th and 20th centuries, is a system of knowledge production. It's really a decision-making mechanism about what we decide socially is true. And it's a system with open architecture, but tons and tons of structure, by which I mean anyone can participate. You can come up with evidence, you can float a hypothesis, you can check someone else's hypothesis, you can be anywhere, it doesn't matter what language you speak or what color you are. But there is a lot of discipline involved. The marketplace of ideas has the idea that, if everybody just goes out there and talks, the truth will somehow emerge from that. That's not true. It's never been true. It's never worked. That kind of environment is unmediated Twitter. It's posturing, trolling, lulls, attention grabbing, all of that stuff is what humans do. It becomes very tribal and very fetid very quickly. So what these rules of the Constitution of Knowledge do is require, for example, that everyone bring evidence and argument that is accessible to everyone else, that no one can end an argument, that everyone needs to be sincere in presenting what they think is actually true and defend it sincerely, that they can't make up stuff. And this is done as a social network of nodes, which are primarily not individuals, but institutions. Think about academic conferences, meetings like this one, journals, newsrooms, courts of law, administrative procedures in government, thousands and thousands of institutional nodes that all have the role of acquiring hypotheses from other nodes in the system, evaluating them, and deciding if they seem more truthful or not, and if they are, sending them on to other nodes, and if they are seen as less truthful or less worthy, not sending them on. So Steve Tellis gets my grant proposal, he looks at it, it's pretty good, maybe he funds it, he looks at it, it's not so good, he drops it in the trash, I go elsewhere. Contrary to standard belief, it is not true that this is a hierarchical gatekeeper system where 3 networks could decide what was news. Because it's a vast network, there are literally an infinite number of ways through it. But if each of the nodes is doing its job and promoting truth over falsehood, then bad ideas will rapidly die out on the system simply because at any given node, the probability of transmitting it is low. The result is that you get a network with what I call a positive epistemic valence when the system works, which is to say, if these nodes are doing their job, what comes out is more likely to be truthful than what goes in. And in fact, if it's a large enough network, a globe-spanning network of millions and millions of minds and institutions following these rules, you get a system that is capable of uncovering the genome of a new virus in a matter of days and then designing a vaccine for it over a weekend, mobilizing millions of minds, huge resources to solve these problems. This is a transformative human technology, and it's a social network on a global scale. However, it depends on a lot of people following a lot of rules that take years and years to inculcate. That's, my education, Many of you have graduate educations. Think about what you have to do to become a physicist or a sociologist. For a journalist, it takes years of training to understand how this works. The same is true in law, and the same is true in administrative government, and so forth. Well, there are lots of ways to attack this system. My book is about some of them. But I'd like to speak for just a minute about the issue of social media. I do not see social media as the root cause of democratic dysfunction. I adore John Haidt, but I think he goes too far in monocausality and blaming social media. I think it's an accelerant, not the underlying problem. The underlying problem is, as I put it in my book, you're being manipulated. There's some powerful actors using very sophisticated cognitive weaponry in order to disarm and disable the constitution of knowledge. That includes stuff like disinformation and canceling. Again, read Truth, Decay, or my book for more. But social media, digital media generally, I include, for example, search engines, is an accelerant. And this is why I'm not a techno-libertarian. The notion that somehow if everybody just talks and no one is moderated, then people will discover for themselves what is true and who is better after all than the individual to make that determination are wrong. Most people, including me, including everyone in this room, is really quite bad at making our own determinations about truth. We need to fall back on an epistemic network that will do that work for us. It's not perfect, but it is far better than the alternatives. Well, suppose you had a system. I described the network earlier. I sometimes describe it as pumps and filters. It's like pumping stations that receive fluids and filter them and pass on cleaner fluids to the next station. What if you flip all the pumps? So they're more likely to pass on the bilge and filter out the purity. And that's kind of what you get in digital media as it's originally designed because it's an advertising medium. So it is incentivized to get eyeballs. That's its business model. And how do you get eyeballs? Well, you don't take a lot of time to figure out what's more likely to be true, what's more likely to be false, and then scrupulously pass on the truer stuff. You accelerate the stuff that's going to get you the most eyeballs. And that, of course, tends to be tribalism and outrage and lulz and all the rest of it. What you get is nodes in the system that are not even epistemically neutral, as we imagined in the 90s the internet would be, you know, truth will rise to the top, marketplace of ideas. It is actually have a negative epistemic valence. It has been shown that false stuff travels faster on the internet than true stuff. And that's not surprising when you consider how cheap it is to make up false stuff and then how easily algorithms and humans can tune it so that we tend to transmit it. The result of that is that this system will be socially destructive. It will be harmful to truth and to our ability to govern ourselves and live with each other unless it acquires at least a neutral and preferably a positive epistemic valence. And that's going to mean that the institutions on this system will have to take what we used to call in mainstream media some amount of editorial responsibility for the contents. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do that, and many of them are very flawed, and we're at the beginning of that process. And no, I'm not for a government agency censoring the internet. Please, no, I'm not for that. However, we are going to have to see these systems and architectures and choices change in ways that make them, for example, introduce friction so that you have less immediate acceleration of garbage. You're going to see fact checking by places like Facebook. I support that. I don't support kicking stuff off that it's fact checked, but demoting, which is what they actually do, it makes some sense. It probably works. We're at the very beginning of this process of understanding how to create pro-social, pro-truth rules in the world of digital media, but it's a job that's going to have to be done.
Thanks. Thanks to both of you. Gordon, you've been a leading columnist for decades. You also were the publisher of the Wall Street Journal, so you had to deal with the financial realities of the news business and the adjustment to digital media. What's your take? What did you learn from that experience? And what do you think of Jonathan and Jennifer's hypotheses?
Yeah, so first, thank you so much for having me. I want to put myself in the camp of an aspiring techno-libertarian again, as I once was. And I'm maybe, and this is a rare position for me, the most optimistic person on your panel, Berin. Despite the fact that I agree completely with the identification of the problems of truth decay from Jennifer and from Jonathan. So as you mentioned, for the last several years, I've been co-founder of NewsGuard. And NewsGuard began with the observation that we've heard today that one of the many problems is that people are being fed algorithmically information, not based on the quality of the information, but based on the engagement of the information as the algorithms were trained to do. So with my old hat on as a longtime Wall Street Journal reporter and then publisher, we did not wake up in the morning and ask ourselves what, giant headline and salacious photograph could we put on a story made up that we knew from data would generate page views, eyeballs. That was not our publishing approach. And for those of us old enough to remember the pre-internet era, you could imagine walking into a newsstand and saying, if you lived in Philadelphia, I want a copy of the Philadelphia Inquirer. I know I don't want the National Enquirer, the grocery store shopper. On the internet, everything looks like National Enquirer. So the problem that we set out to solve was, as people are thumbing through their Facebook feeds or looking at a search result, could we intervene against the algorithms by giving users instant information about whether this is a generally trustworthy source or a generally untrustworthy source? Is this generally the Philadelphia Inquirer or generally National Enquirer? And I can get into details about how we go about it, but I think for this stage of the discussion, the interesting thing about that is there is an area where the data say people appreciate some expertise. People appreciate getting a judgment based on what we describe as a diverse set of experienced journalists about the adherence to journalistic standards of journalistic enterprises. In other words, if Uncle Willie has shared with you some news story from a brand you've never heard of, can you instantly get a sense of the nature of that source? Is it generally a trustworthy one or is it not? And ideally, if you need to, let crazy Uncle Willie know that he's fallen for a conspiracy theory or for something that is really untrue. There's a lot of data that say that everybody, even the 10 to 20% of people who get a significant amount of their information from misinformation sources, chiefly on social media, even that 10 to 20% appreciate that information and change their behavior accordingly, much less likely to believe or share untrustworthy information. So I'm left with being a long-term techno-libertarian and even maybe utopian, as I once was 20 years ago, but only because I think that the platforms, for a variety of reasons, are going to be forced to enable their consumers to have access to the kind of information that's required in order to reverse the pumping and filtering that we're seeing, as Jonathan has described it, to reverse the truth decay. But it is going to take quite a lot of commitment by the part of different actors, including, I regret to say, regulators. I am enough of a remaining libertarian to be allergic to regulation. And the one thing I would say about this area, without getting too deep into it, is my view of Section 230 and the immunity that essentially was given to digital platforms is that is a reminder that we should be very careful when we decide not to apply the common law to one particular industry. So the digital platforms, in my view, were founded during an era of immunity. And unlike chemical companies or oil shippers, are not held liable for the known harms they cause. And I think that's unsustainable. And Section 230 will need to be reformed in some ways. Not, as Jonathan and I completely agree, not to give government any control over content, but to give consumers some mediating institutions in order to defend themselves, protect themselves against the algorithms, to empower them with more information so that we can return to that simpler time of a marketplace of ideas, rather than where we are now, which is essentially everyone being subject to some degree or another to the algorithms that, as Jonathan correctly said, are geared entirely for engagement and bilge rather than information and the quality of the information.
Well, if there's one thing you can count on in any discussion of tech policy, it's that everyone will talk about Section 230, no matter what the topic. And thank you for bringing that up. We're going to talk about that today. I find that the term libertarianism itself is subject to a great deal of decay. I thought that it was about the role of government and not about society or knowledge. But I understand perfectly why both of you have used the term in that way. I mean, you've described something that I think is sort of more, perhaps we could call it epistemic atomism, the idea that everyone should decide everything for themselves and that they don't need any experts to decide anything. And that increasingly is what people call libertarianism today. It's not what I would call libertarianism, but that's a thing. It's a real problem. So let's start there before we get into the role of government or the raging debate about Section 230. Just with this basic question of knowledge in society and experts. You've all talked about different kinds of experts. Jonathan, Gordon, you were both journalists. That's a kind of expertise. I'd just be curious to hear from each of you what role you think experts should play in the constitution of knowledge. So Jonathan, why don't you start?
Well, the reality-based community, which is what I call the communities of professionals that rely on the constitution of knowledge and that propagate it to the next generation, is basically an expert network. I mean, you can do some things as an amateur physicist or biologist, but really not very much. You can do some things as an amateur journalist, but a little bit more, but not very much. So it's in the nature of the thing that what you've got are experts is the word often used. I prefer the term professionals because it's really about the protocols that people use to uncover knowledge and advance it as much as it is about the personal credentials. So yeah, it's a professional network. And that is always going to sit uneasily with our populist era. I think it's important to understand and help other people understand and remind ourselves that the expertise that counts is not in the individual. It's not that Berin knows more about epidemiology than Jennifer, therefore I will believe Berin and not Jennifer when he says close the schools and she says, no, don't close the schools. That's not really the way to think about it. The better way to think about it is expertise as opposed to experts. It arrives as an emanation of the system as a whole that we've been talking about, the constitution of knowledge. And the trick is to try to take that emergent consensus as it evolves over time and tune the system so that it is less hostile to that kind of expertise. And I should have mentioned, I'm a fan of NewsGuard. I was a user until I accidentally forgot to reinstall it on my new browsers. Sorry, Gordon. But it's good that way because it gives people some transparency into, so are these people, is this outlet that I'm looking at now, is it following the rules? That's more important than, is this outlet right in every particular case? But is it running corrections? Is it revealing its sources of donors? These are important things to know about whether you're talking, whether you're dealing with real as opposed to fake expertise.
Jennifer?
Well, so I guess I think about expertise less from a philosophical perspective and more about how experts should be communicating their expertise, because that's where I see the real gap. The way experts communicate often is jargony. It's difficult to understand. It's not accessible. It's filled with statistics. So as a person who loves statistics, that's great for me, but it's not great for most people. The average expert also doesn't look much like the average American. We know that people trust people who are similar to them, people who look like them, people who can tell stories, who can weave facts into narratives. That's why disinformation is so powerful, because it often comes in the forms of stories. So it's accessible, it's relatable, and that builds trust. And so for me, when we think about the role that experts play, I think the biggest thing I challenge myself with all the time is, how do I make this accessible? How do I make this something that the average person wants to read and will understand? And oftentimes the expert is not always the best communicator of that information. You know, in DC, the Faith in Vaccines initiative had a lot of success. Why? Because the religious leaders and communities were trusted. They were able to break through where scientific experts were not. And so I think that as an expert community, one area that needs to receive a lot more attention is how we communicate. How do we communicate in an accessible way? And who should be doing that communication? Partnerships between scientific experts and community leaders might be one way to go. And who the trusted interlocutor is not going to be the same for all communities. You know, if I show up in certain communities, no one's going to trust me because they don't know me and I don't look like them. But there are people within those communities who are trusted. So identifying who are those trusted messengers and how we get them with the right messages or with the facts and evidence to communicate those messages to the communities. That's where I really think a lot of the focus needs to be.
So Gordon, again, you tried to figure out how newspapers could adjust, very large newspapers could adjust to the digital era. What do you think about the changes in media? I mean, how much of the problem is the media? And apart from NewsGuard and what you've already said, what do you think we can do to encourage the media to provide expertise, as Jonathan has described, better?
Yeah, so I think the first comment I'd like to make is that when I was growing up at the Wall Street Journal, starting many years ago, one of the lessons that permeated the place, and I think still does, is that people in news stories are never referred to as an expert. So even before the internet, even before Truth Decay, there was an understanding among editors at the Journal that readers don't want to be told this person is an expert. They want evidence for why that person should be believed for that person's expertise. And so I think you'll rarely see, if ever, somebody simply referred to as an expert. You'll see news stories that explain this person is, won a Nobel Prize in this, or was CEO of these 4 companies, or whatever it is, to give readers the information that they need to make some judgment about whether that qualifies as someone who they think has the expertise for those views to be shared. I think journalism generally it doesn't have that policy and has elevated some sources to expert level and other sources to non-expert level. And Jonathan talked a little bit about some of the criteria that journalists use, including, quite importantly, whether they correct the record. Another one being, do they separate news and opinion in a way that is quite clear to readers? And I think there's been quite a lot of decay in that area among even legacy traditional news organizations that has led people to be less trusting. If you're presenting yourself as a source of news, then be a source of news, don't be a source of opinionated news. So I think the media, including well-known brands, have to bear some of the responsibility for the decline in trust in them. But I think by the same token, there are several news brands at the moment whose marketing campaigns are fully focused on, we are a trustworthy brand. You can trust us. That includes Reuters, it includes Bloomberg, it includes the Wall Street Journal. And I see that there's an opportunity in the market for some brands to differentiate themselves, not based on which tribe they serve best, but based on trying to respect readers enough so that they give readers the information they need to make up their minds about who they want to believe. And as the filtering process works, individuals have a role as well in determining which media outlets they choose to trust more than others.
Well, that sounds like a clearly techno-libertarian thesis. So is Gordon right? Is the problem that we don't empower individual users enough, or do we need larger systemic solutions?
Well, it's all of the above. It's not either or. You need to help people make choices that are informed, but you also need institutions that will guide people toward better choices. We have been in a situation a little bit like this before, a bit over 100 years ago. In the late 19th century, American journalism was a swamp of hyper-partisanship and fake news. H.L. Mencken, if you read his memoirs, the greatest journalist of his generation, talks about how much fun he and other reporters in Baltimore had coordinating made-up stories to put in the paper so that instead of actually reporting, they could spend their day in the bar. And he thinks this is hilarious. So how do we get out of that? Well, it's standards and practices and professionalizations and starting to create norms and institutions and guardrails. So in the early 20th century, the American Society of Newspaper Editors is formed. And the first thing it does is issue a code of conduct. And it's got some stuff that now seems obvious, but it's like, be truthful, be accurate. Well, how about that? Someone had to say it. You get the opening of journalism schools, starts in around the same period, which began training and inculcating a generation in these rules. You get the founding of prizes like the Pulitzer, and then many others, which reward and incentivize good truth-based journalism. And within a generation or two, you move from William Randolph Hearst's Yellow Press to, I don't know, the golden age of the networks, Edward R. Murrow. And you also move the market with it. You shift customer demand. So they start liking this model. They start buying it. It finds a business model. The question is, can we do that now? And some of that will be through tools like Gordon's. But if you look at Gordon's wonderful NewsGuard, part of what's so interesting about it is, yes, it incentivizes individuals to look at the credentials and the practices behind the site they're looking at. But what NewsGuard is doing, as I understand it, is it also goes to the news information organizations and says, we want to know more about your practices. So then the organization has to have a discussion about it. And then the organization is incentivized to get the green rating, which can mean cleaning up its act. So you actually begin to get here an institutional check as well. And to me, that's where the ultimate magic is going to be, finding these levers to get institutions to set pro-social instead of anti-social norms.
Jennifer, your book covers other periods of truth decay in American history, but you conclude that this one is different. Why, and how optimistic are you about market forces today?
Well, so a big commonality in all these other periods that we see is that there's a change in the way information is produced and consumed. So yellow journalism is one example. The rise of radio in the 20s is another. The rise of television in the late 60s, early 70s is another. And every time we get new technology to provide news and information, there's this messy period after where things get really jumbled. And I think that makes sense. We're getting used to a new technology. As Jonathan said, we're just beginning now in the social media era to develop the institutions and the practices and the friction points that we need to make sure that we take advantage of the benefits of social media without having so much of the messiness, so much of the costs. I do think that this period is different in a couple of ways. And the key thing I look at is the willingness to just throw facts aside. There's a huge portion of the public that just in the political domain, they just don't care. They don't care about the facts if the facts don't fit their narrative, their worldview, their mental model. And to get them to get off of those facts, whether you're talking about conspiracies like QAnon or election fraud, is really difficult because those facts, those conspiracies, are now part of their identity. They hold those as part of their identity. So if you take those conspiracies away, you're taking away a piece of their identity. And there's many issues that are all kind of bundled up like that. And so we now have this situation where the political and institutional factors make it so that we can't really just address the information problem. Even if we get a check, even if we have services like NewsGuard, and even if we're able to develop ways to insert friction in the social media environment that helps truthful information rise to the top, there's this group of people and this set of practices and institutions and incentives in our political infrastructure that feeds the exact opposite. So unless we're addressing that problem, we're never going to be able to address the information problem. Because as much as I agree with Jonathan's points about the professionalization of journalism and having institutional change, the bottom line is that these news outlets need to make a profit. If they don't make a profit, they go out of business. And that money driver leads to a different set of decisions than in some cases than would be made if they were focused only on getting the green rating from Gordon. And you see that even in news outlets that I would consider generally trustworthy, some of the stuff they publish is not trustworthy. And it's not trustworthy because they're trying to get clicks. They're trying to get eyeballs. You know, I was really taken aback I met with a Washington Post reporter who told me that like there's a big board. I've never been there, so some of you may have been there. A big board with all the like stories and how many clicks they've gotten that day. So you're basically like, I guess they're not in the office as much anymore, but that incentive, it's like a, you know, an Orange Theory or a Peloton class where you're trying to like get higher on the list. That's driving at the same time. So we have good forces, but we also have these bad forces. And why is that board up there? Because they need to turn a profit. So unless we're addressing these like institutional drivers, and I would say one is the business model in journalism, and the other is the polarization and the political drivers, we're still going to have this problem. So I guess I'm the most pessimistic on the panel.
I think footnote, I don't think the Washington Post has a board like that. Some places do, but not the Post, not the Times. Most mainstream media is shunning that practice.
Well, let's talk about market forces for a moment here. So two specific things. So Gordon, one thing that NewsGuard does besides the browser extension, as I understand it, is to help advertisers decide where they want to spend their money and to encourage them to spend their money on, well, if they say they want to spend it on real journalism, or not spend it on, let's say, having their content shown online next to sources that promote disinformation. You have some technologies for doing that. So why don't you show us what you're doing on that note?
Sure. I hope you can see my slide.
We can.
Excellent. So let me just start by adding to what Jonathan said. If you can see the 9 criteria that we use here, these are exactly the kind of criteria that were developed first a century ago at journalism schools, and they include: does the website repeatedly publish false content? Does it disclose its ownership? Does it have corrections? This is the process of journalism. So this is not fact-checking per se. It's, does this outlet follow the general practices of journalism? And exactly as Jonathan said, about 20% of the sites that we've rated have done something in order to improve their rating from us, improving their disclosure policies, their transparency policies, or their credibility policies, or both. Some, however, to your question, Berin, are actually in the business of profiting from misinformation. This slide actually features naturalnews.com, which is a large network of healthcare hoax sites, a couple hundred of them. 2 business models. One is programmatic advertising. The other is selling nutritional supplements. Programmatic advertising, as you probably know, is algorithmically determined advertising. A brand will have its display ad on a website, not because it chose to advertise on the Washington Post as opposed to the New York Times, but because a demand side platform like Google or Facebook or some part of the ad tech infrastructure has determined that this reader is the kind of reader that that advertiser wants to reach. And as a result of that, we've estimated that there's $2.6 billion a year in unintended advertising going to sites like this, to unreliable sites. $2.6 billion is a lot of money. It's maybe only 2% of programmatic advertising. That's the leading source of digital advertising these days. But that helps to account for why there are so many sources of misinformation in so many different categories. And yes, our largest revenue actually is in this area of trying to help brands and advertising agencies and ad tech companies keep ads off of misinformation sites and steer the advertising instead to high quality news sites. If we can help make that $2.6 billion go to 1.3 billion to 650,000 to a few hundred million, that will have a significant impact on the amount of misinformation that is being funded. It won't eliminate the problem. Vladimir Putin will continue to fund RT and Sputnik, and we found more than 200 other websites that publish Russian disinformation with unclear ownership and control. Some large number of those likely paid for by the Russian government. So there will continue to be categories of misinformation, but I think this is an area where going after the revenue model could be quite helpful. It's not going to address Jennifer's very good point. And Jonathan, I think you're right, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, they don't have that board up in their newsroom, but a lot of places do. The move toward more reliance on digital subscribers rather than advertisers is ameliorating that problem, but it does tend to reduce the quality of even the high quality publishers. But I do think that there are economic reasons to be hopeful that those that are advertising supported, and that's a large percentage of them, over time will be demonetized. It's not, I did my own one and only op-ed for the New York Times, which is saying something, from a Wall Street Journal alum, was on this issue of blue chip brands unintentionally supporting disinformation sites. And our data determined that Warren Buffett was the single largest advertiser on Russian disinformation sites through Geico, which he controls. Geico is the biggest advertiser on Sputnik News. Did not intend to advertise there, but that's in the nature of programmatic advertising. And that problem, I think we can go a long way to helping to solve.
So I apologize for misrepresenting the Washington Post. I think the general point remains that this is a driver in the news industry. Even if the Washington Post doesn't have a news board, I imagine that they are tracking it and that the reporters know that. But I apologize.
To defend Jennifer, I think every newsroom, including the Wall Street Journals and including the Washington Post, at one time did have.
Well, maybe they did when I was told the story, so I'm just behind.
And I didn't mean to call you out. The point I'm making actually is that I'm a journalist, I'm very mainstream, and we're really fighting this. Newsrooms out there, reporters, editors are fighting very hard against the currents to debase the product, and it gets harder every day. And if there's a problem out there that is really tough, that absolutely must get solved if we care about our information ecology, it's funding the news business, the reality-based news business. I think we probably all agree on that.
Okay, so what about expertise in government? I mean, what would it look like for Americans to be able to trust Congress or to trust government agencies when they make decisions or they tell people that they should or shouldn't do something? Well, across the board. I mean, in general. Okay,
Yeah.
so Jennifer, why don't you start?
Could you clarify the question a little bit?
Well, so it seems to me you both talk about the role of institutions, and you describe truth decay as being in part about declining trust in institutions. And of course, we talked a lot about the media. But one of those sectors is the government. So there are lots of government institutions that used to command a lot of trust. And when they made a recommendation about a problem, let's say, just for example, let's say it was dealing with the hole in the ozone layer in the early 1990s, right? There were people in government who made a recommendation. They said it was a real problem, and there was trust that was a real problem, and that Congress and the president worked together to solve it. But that mechanism is broken down, and we could think of lots of other examples. That's what Senator Romney's op-ed was describing. How do we rebuild trust in government so that when they actually study a problem, make a recommendation, and there's some back and forth, and what comes out of it is some kind of solution to a problem? So it's a small question. So.
Yikes, so you're asking me to basically solve American
Yes.
democracy.
In 1 minute, please.
I mean, so when you look at data on trust in government, it's really partisan. People tend to trust they tend to trust the government when it's their party and not trust government when it's not their party. They also tend to trust local government, again, because it's more immediate, because they can see it. So I guess I'll point to kind of two possible routes here. The first is I think we have to do something about the polarization in this country, because I don't really see there being a sustainable solution to the institutional government problem we face unless we can somehow overcome this divisiveness that prevents us from getting anything done. I mean, if you look at the way Congress functions, it's not trust inspiring. Now, there's also sort of a public relations problem here in the sense that Congress actually does pass a lot of stuff, but it's small stuff that doesn't get the coverage. So when they fail on something, it's big news. And when they pass small things that actually, make a big difference kind of on the margins, we don't hear about it. So that's part of the problem. So maybe part of it is, they need better PR. But part of it is just this divisiveness. And to that, I don't know that I see a solution. I mean, I see us heading down a really bad path, and I worry that the only thing that's going to reset it is some kind of crisis. But I do have more hope about local government, not necessarily state level, because that's also unfortunately become very partisan at this point, but people do trust their local governments. And so I really think that pushing the information down, trying to have the people who are communicating those recommendations to be as immediate to the people who are receiving it as possible is a possible path forward. And so maybe that's a role for the individual representatives in Congress on certain issues where partisanship isn't such a problem. And part of it is, I think, building up community governments and local governments and trying to get them to be doing some of this communicating and start rebuilding trust from the bottom up. Because I think that the rot, for lack of a better word, is much less there. I have kind of more faith there.
So let's close on this thing. Jennifer, I'll give you the last word, but Gordon and let's start with Jonathan. What are your reactions?
Well, in a way, the question is framed so broadly that it becomes impossible to answer. At the macro level, we know a lot sociologically about. We know it's easy to demolish trust and much harder to build it. We know it takes a lot of time and a lot of institutional performance. But the answer, there's no global answer to this, right? This is about individuals and especially institutions going about their work with integrity and showing that every day and figuring out ways to patch the holes in the systems that are being drilled by new forms of corruption and malfeasance. And it's going to look, there is no one size fits all answer. This is everything from academia, not letting itself get politicized in the hiring department at, I don't know, pick your university. And adopting the Chicago principles and meaning it. And it is about newspapers keeping opinions separate and running corrections. And it is about institutions of government not allowing, for example, the White House to dictate the contents of a weather report, on and on and on. But these steps are at the micro level, at the institutional level. And there's something each of us, everyone in this room is probably a member of the reality-based community. We are involved in some way in the truth-seeking businesses, and there is something each of us can do in our environment or in our world to make the environment more truth-friendly and more trustworthy. And that can be as simple as not retweeting that, that silly meme that happens to be wrong, or siding with someone who's being canceled, even if you disagree with them, coming to their defense, all kinds of things. That said, a big point of my book, not talked about enough, is that we often talk as if, institutions, we're walking along one day and all our institutions failed and then trust in them collapsed. And that is not the story. Our institutions have done remarkably well at protecting us against depredations of, for example, Trump and the MAGA movement. We had dozens and dozens of professionals all the way through the government refusing, for example, to falsify election reports at great personal expense. What we also have and undervalue is a 40-year concerted campaign by very powerful profit and power-seeking sources in America to demolish trust. And one example of that, among many, is Rush Limbaugh, who was fond of talking about what he called the four corners of deceit, which I think were academia, science, journalism, and government. We're talking about Stop the Steal, a massive Russian-style disinformation campaign being run against the election, against the American people, and not incidentally against the media. So we have to be aware that these institutions that we all rely on to distinguish fact from fiction and truth from falsehood are under a drumbeat of heavy and sophisticated attacks by powerful and motivated political forces. And to me, that is the starting point. Understanding it didn't just happen, it's an attack.
Gordon, closing thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I'd like to focus my comments on government, because I think at some level that's the most obvious to many people. And my encouragement for government is that one of the learnings about trust that every institution has found that's tried to figure out how to increase trust is that people expect much greater transparency and disclosure. They expect to understand issues much better than in the past. In their private lives, they can get so much information about the next car they buy or insurance policy they buy. They expect that now from people who are setting rules and regulations for them. And yet government governs more with less disclosure. It claims to act in all manner of areas without disclosure. There's as you all know, a regulatory debate now about whether the executive branch, Congress and the executive branch will be able to continue to delegate regulations to independent agencies or quasi-independent agencies. That's part of the problem. People don't understand where regulations come from, why they're there, why they should be trusted. So I think all institutions have to think about how to rebuild trust. I completely agree with what Jonathan has said about universities, about journalism, about other institutions. I think government is a big part of the problem, and it'll take quite some time, I'm afraid, to remedy.
Jennifer, closing thoughts?
I agree very much with Gordon on the transparency point. We did do some work when we tried to understand why people distrust organizations, and information and transparency, honesty was one of the key factors. Another was competence, believing that the actors are competent in their jobs, whatever that means to an individual. I agree with Jonathan that it's important to remember that this didn't just happen overnight, that this was kind of a long-term process, and to recognize that our institutions did hold under incredible strain, under the Trump administration. I worry though that they are like weakened now, and that now another actor who came in who wanted to pursue a similar path would have sort of like a map of how to do that, because they've now seen, they learned from the time that previous actors have spent trying to dismantle bureaucracy and undermine trust. And now not only are the institutions weaker, but they know kind of where that effort ran aground and how to address that more quickly. So I don't get solace from the fact that the institutions held. I still worry about what might happen in the future. I also think it's really important to understand that this distrust is not just in news; it's like system-wide. So the really interesting thing I thought about Gallup's recent survey that came out is that trust was down in basically every single institution. There are a few exceptions that managed to maintain trust, were like the medical system and public schools or something like that. Maybe that, I actually don't know if it was public schools. I think that actually went down. But there were like one or two institutions that managed to maintain trust. But trust in everything else was down. Church, organized labor, big business, small business, like trust in everything was down. And so I think that suggests something about sort of like a broader mentality that I think is important to recognize, that the problem that we have is not just an information problem. It's not just a government problem. It's like, it's much wider. It's kind of like now seeped out and infected everything. And that's why I think this has to be multidisciplinary. Like our response can't just be any one discipline, because the problem is everywhere and we need like all hands on deck.
Well, agreed. We'll pick up some of these threads in our next discussion. So we'll take a very short break and then
During which everyone should download NewsGuard and install it on their browser.
Thank you.
by Truth, Decay, and the Constitution of Knowledge by our authors here. But we'll take a short break. Commissioner Phillips will share his thoughts on where expert agencies in general are going after the Supreme Court's decision on major questions doctrine. And we'll then talk about the topic that Gordon raised, non-delegation as a coming potential change in administrative law. So we'll see you back here in just a few minutes.